Welcome, everybody, and thank you for making it along to another Sacred Wisdom podcast. We are going to discuss Tartaria and Hyperborea today and the connections between the two. So I am here again with the amazing Stephen Denman, and he's going to discuss the history of Hyperborea. Tartaria, a lot of the culture or the civilization of Tartaria seem to have a lot of influence from this land of Hyperborea. Now, first of all, just talk a little bit about Hyperborea and where was the land of Hyperborea?
Well, the landmass of Hyperborea, as with the civilization of Hyperborea, centered on a number of different geographic locations in the Northern Hemisphere. So we've got to remember the largest landmass expanse of Hyperborea was northern Russia. And this centered mainly in areas such as the Kola Peninsula in the Murmansk Oblast of northwestern Russia, and obviously across what is known as the Polar Urals and the Northern Urals, which are obviously part of the Ural Mountains in north-central Russia, and then across to the Murmansk Peninsula and the Russian Far East, which covers obviously parts of northern Siberia, in that area of northeastern Russia. But there were other geographic locations such as Iceland and Greenland and Spitsbergen, and also parts of the Canadian Arctic, as well as the Arctic North Polar region, obviously, and that obviously includes the Arctic continent and the various islands that exist in places like the Kara Sea and the Laptev Sea and so forth, off the coastline of northern Russia. So it was a vast expanse, both as a multifaceted landmass and also as a civilization. And they were using in Hyperborea crystalline occult technology in the form of pyramidal structures to transmit telluric electrical energy as a power source across these vast expanses.
So what happened to Hyperborea? And obviously, it's spoken about in Greek mythology and various other historical records, but it seems to be always classed as a mythological concept that it was just some sort of fantasy land. But what actually happened in the sense of the destruction, or how that civilization was destroyed? Or what do you think happened?
I would say it was major atmospheric changes at the time connected to the solar cycles of our yellow dwarf star, the sun, and obviously also the cosmic radiation in the interstellar medium of the solar system, and these various astrophysical factors, how they interplayed with the atmospheric conditions, shall we say, in the northern hemisphere of planet Earth at the time, towards the last, few decades or few years of the civilization of Hyperborea, as it had thrived and developed over many, many thousands of years in those geographic locations that I've just mentioned. And obviously all of that was disrupted. There would have been massive amounts of inundation with the melting of ice and glacial sheeting, and the reforming of the glacial sheeting in new areas, maybe perhaps where there was more arable farmland and various kinds of agricultural tracts that were used for the growing of fruits, vegetables, and cereal crops by the Hyperboreans. But we know from Greek mythology that the climate there was described by many of the Greek philosophers, the chroniclers, and historians of classical Greece as being idyllic, as having almost a beautiful sort of balmy, summery weather all year round, and vast golden orchards full of apples and pears and plums and cherries. So it appears that the Arctic North Polar region, northern Russia, and perhaps even parts of Iceland, Greenland, Spitsbergen, were really very fertile areas. And then all of that was disrupted with these atmospheric changes, massive rainstorms, perhaps seaquake and earthquake, and therefore tectonic activity in the Northern Hemisphere. And the populations of these Nordic Hyperboreans, or you can perhaps call them Hyperborean Aryans, then had to migrate in a southward direction away from the Arctic North Polar region into other parts of the vast landmass, which is the Asian continent, and therefore refounded new colonies and societies and communities there. And obviously, historically and politically, they morphed over time. And, shall we say, the civilization and the landmass of Hyperborea became nothing but just another story from Greek mythology.
It was around 25,800 BC, Hyperborea supposedly existed. First of all, how did anybody come to that date?
I think if you again look at the political movement called Russian Hyperboreanism in the Russian Federation, you look at many of the blogs and the forums there, where they obviously are writing in Cyrillic Russian, so there isn't direct English language translations on that date of 25,800 BC for the, shall we say, the demise of the civilization of Hyperborea in the Northern Hemisphere, especially in Northern Russia and across parts of Iceland and Greenland. But it's known from looking at the Paleolithic age, which is, the Paleolithic age is a vast expanse chronologically of time for archaeologists and also anthropologists who are using those timescales to look at. And we know that a lot of Russian archaeology has uncovered very interesting artifacts where they've used C14 radiocarbon dating that go back to a time of around 30,000 BC, ranging through to 25,000 BC, again in places like the Kola Peninsula of the Murmansk Oblast in northwestern Russia, and also in parts of the polar Ural Mountains, and also in the northern Ural Mountains in north central Russia, where there has been remnants of pyramidal structures found, various strange types of petroglyphic writing, and various artifacts and architectural remains of what appear to be temples, many of which contain the correct amounts of carbon because of the local materials that have been used and so forth. And so they have managed to do analysis on those. And also, I believe they've used thermoluminescence as a form of timeline analysis as well. So very interesting that kind of scientific knowledge is not sort of more widely known about in, shall we say, Western science. I don't see anything going on at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. concerning what these Russian archaeologists have
Very
uncovered.
rarely anything goes on in there.
Yeah, and obviously what's happening is this timeline 25,800 BC, and there's actually other timelines they've given going back beyond even 30,000 BC. I think even going back to 32,000 BC, 34,000 BC. But a lot of the Western media, when they pick up on these scientific based stories, it's classed as quackery, it's classed as scientific misinterpretation, that they don't know what they're doing in the Russian Federation. Again, it's all completely dismissed out of hand. And so it's therefore not given any real scientific regard. It's not seen as something to be taken seriously. So I think that pretty much summarizes that as a situation.
Do you think the timelines are correct in the sense, do you think they're misplaced? Do you think it could be closer than 25,000 years ago or 27,000 years ago that Hyperborea existed?
I think the remnants of it continued obviously way beyond 25,800 BC or 27,800 years ago. I think you'll find that the actual there were many much more micro scale level societies and communities of these Nordic Hyperboreans or Hyperborean Aryans that refounded and established new farming and perhaps agricultural based civilizations across other areas, say in the Russian Far East of Siberia, and also would have actually gone down into even areas around the Himalayan mountains and parts of Central Asia where Persia or Iran is today, and obviously into northern India, and would have gone across into parts of, I would say, Eastern Europe into the Danube Valley, would have gone over into countries that we know today as Poland and Hungary and perhaps Bulgaria. And even they would have even founded sort of smaller civilizations, perhaps in the Alpine mountains around where the Czech Republic is, perhaps parts of Germany as well.
Do you think they would have actually formed the Scythian Empire, the Hyperboreans?
I think the Nordic Hyperboreans, or perhaps they can be called Hyperborean Aryans, they did actually sort of morphed culturally and historically into the development of what became known as the Scythian Empire. And we have to remember the Scythian Empire, Scythia Major and Scythia Minor, were based around what is known as the Russian steppes, or the Asiatic steppes, which is predominantly in the landmass today known as the Russian Federation, but it also obviously overlaps into parts of Central Asia and northwards of where Persia or Iran is today. So we know that the Scythians were an inheritor civilization of much older practices. They were experts in the use of goldsmithing, silversmithing. They were expert metallurgists. They had expertise in cavalry, horsemanship. They were classed as fearsome and noble warriors on the Russian steppes. And it's interesting to note that there was the racial characteristic of the bright red hair, the pale complexions, the red beards, and also they would cover their bodies in very ornate tattoos. They would adorn themselves, both the male and female Scythians, in very eloquent looking and very exquisite gold jewelry, and would interweave much of the gold jewelry into their armors. They had, highly glistening polished shields and swords. They were expert archers, hunter-gatherers. So they were a devolved civilization, the higher kinds of occult technology that the Hyperboreans had, in the Arctic North Polar region going back 25,800 BC. A lot of that had been lost. So only a certain fraction of the expertise and the knowledge and the know-how, therefore, from the Hyperboreans had been inherited. What really had been inherited was the genetics, the lineage of their ancestors, these Nordic Hyperboreans. And therefore, the Scythians really, in many ways, were the prime movers and carriers of those traditions and customs from Hyperborea.
So do you think Hyperborea exists still today, or do you think it's been destroyed in the northern part of Russia?
Yeah, the remnants still exist in vast, remote areas all across northern Russia. Yeah. As I've mentioned, the Kola Peninsula and the Murmansk Oblast in northwestern Russia is just one example. We have to remember that the Ural Mountains in north-central Russia is such a vast area, and we know in Greek mythology that the Polar Urals and the northern Urals, as well as the rest of the Ural Mountains, were classed as the Riphaean Mountains in Greek mythology. And this is the vast reaches where the griffins, these legendary hybrid-looking quadrupedal creatures, guarded the golden treasures of the luminous tunnels and luminous caverns that literally interlaced through thousands of square kilometers underneath the Polar Urals and the northern Urals in north-central Russia, which then lends one to believe that perhaps in those areas, the Hyperboreans had vast caches of these legendary golden treasures, not just coinage, but, ornaments and various types of golden antiques, treasures the likes of which perhaps most human beings on planet Earth have never seen. So
so just out of interest, was it a monetary system? Were they using that gold and silver as a monetary system, or were they using their metals as another way as conductors? Was there a form of barter or trade in Hyperborea?
I think they had some kind of rudimentary system. We've got to remember that I believe they were a much more advanced civilization surrounded on Earth by much, shall we say, more primitive based cultures, or shall we say societies and communities. And I don't believe that coins had what they were used for, which was a form of transaction and currency, were originally used for that. I believe they were aspects of some type of occult technology. The shape of them could have been they could have been components that fitted into mechanisms that were used. They were circular, like discs, if you like. So their original purpose, like so much with many civilizations, the original purpose of what specific objects, devices, mechanisms.
They're almost like little crystals. They could be like crystals, or in a way, obviously formed by a human, but created man-made.
But gold coins or gold discs, if you like, I mean, they could have slotted into some kind of piece of machinery to create some type of resonance. Again, this is just pure speculation, but in terms, if you think about the idea of occult technology, we think of the fact that all these remnant pyramids have been found, that, you know, there has been caches of coins found. They don't have the heads of monarchs on or any dates inscribed on them, but a lot of these artifacts go back to such vast periods in prehistoric history that we have to really understand there must be a rethink as to what was going on back in that, you know, in the latter part of the Upper Paleolithic. We have to understand that we've been given really quite ridiculous theories by Western science on what was going on, not just in the Paleolithic age, but also the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. We've been led to believe that what is going on is that humans have plodded along for thousands and thousands of years as primitive, you know, and they were covered in, you know, animal furs, hiding in caves and waving their spears. And then along comes the mammoths, and out comes, you know, Homo neanderthalensis roaring in the midday sun, and off they trot. You know, I believe there's some truth in that, yes. But again, I think that, you know, if you take a look at a lot of the cave paintings going back, you know, 25,000, 30,000, 35,000 BC and more, there's many cave paintings on this planet, such as in parts of France, for example, where you have what appeared to be upright, noble-looking bipedal men and women who are dressed in very contemporary-looking clothing, and these have been carbon dated. They, you know, thermoluminescent analyzed to be correct in their chronological timelines. So again, that alone is another small example of this historical conflict, this contradiction with what we've been told is real, what we've been told we have to accept and we should not question. And when you get, you know, numerous expeditions and excursions have been done by Russian archaeologists, Russian historians, people of high standing, you know, in the Russian Academy of Sciences, in Moscow, in Russia, going up into the Kola Peninsula in the Murmansk Oblast of northwestern Russia, and organizing excursions that last for, you know, for 2 weeks, 3-4 weeks at a time, up into the Ural Mountains, and uncovering very, very anomalous and very strange, you know, artifacts, archaeological remains that then, you know, bring to light the question: is the official version of history something that we should just carry on accepting? Or does you know, a greater level of scientific analysis need to be done? And yes, it needs to be done. But again, we have this incredible amount of resistance going on in Western science, because they invested a vast amount of time, money, and energy and resources, you know, in publishing for the last, you know, 80, 90, even 100 plus years, the same repeating information.
I think the interesting, as you're saying all that, what springs to mind is 2001 and Kubrick, the scene where the bone actually flies up and then cuts to a spaceship. But also Kubrick says a lot in his movies, so it's very interesting about evolution, how he discusses it and talks about it. But yes, I'm the Greek mythology side and Hyperborea. What I'm really interested in is the connection to Boreas Olympus and the Greek deity. So there's all this connection as well. That's very blurred in the mainstream Greek history. They don't sort of mention too much about Hyperborea, but the moment I've kind of stepped in with you and we're discussing it, you've opened up all these worms from all this research that you've looked at. And so discuss about the connection of Boreas Olympus to Hyperborea.
And one of the 12 Olympians, known as Apollo Olympos, actually resided, his actual homestead or residency was in the landmass of Hyperborea. He didn't really frequent his existence in Mount Olympus, in the land masses of classical Greece, obviously including the Greek islands in the Mediterranean basin. And so he was obviously known archetypally as the solar deity. So he had a golden chariot that was drawn by these huge swans that would take him across the cosmic heavens. Obviously, these are archetypal symbols, perhaps those swans were some type of spacecraft. So that touches on kind of the work and research of Eric von Daniken and people like Peter Colosimo and other researchers. And also, I'd say people like Brinsley Lapoa Trench, who was absolutely fantastic researcher and author into the connections between Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and the UFO phenomena. So we know that the connection is Apollo Olympos, who resided in the rather balmy, summery climate of Hyperborea in the Arctic North Polar region, somewhere around the Riphaean Mountains, which encompasses obviously the polar Urals and the northern Urals of north central Russia, and also going out into the Kara Sea and the Laptev Sea. And then you obviously going from there out into the Arctic Ocean, and then up into the Arctic continent. It's interesting to note we have the Aurora Borealis, which is these wonderful electromagnetic waves of light that emanate.
What do you think that is? What do you think the Northern Lights are?
I believe that we do have two entrances. We have a North Polar entrance in the Arctic continent and a South Polar entrance in the Antarctic continent that lead into what I believe is a hollow Earth. I believe in terms of the laws of physics and what we understand as gravity, the electromagnetic forces or impulses, it's very different inside the hollow Earth than, because of the changes to the laws of physics. I believe that there is a great internal sun or a great inner sun that has some kind of electromagnetic and plasmic effect that creates these atmospheric, shall we say, reverberations that then manifest as the Aurora Borealis and the Aurora Australis on planet Earth.
And do you think that's connected to Hyperborea? That they were aware of the inner Earth at Hyperborea. They're aware of this whole civilization around Earth.
Well, we have to remember that, again, if you go back even before Greek mythology, if you look at the actual folklore of the Sami or the Laplanders, living, these are the indigenous Asiatic tribes that live in parts of northern Russia. They live up in the Kola Peninsula, the Murmansk Oblast in northwestern Russia. They're known to have many communities that exist in parts of the Ural Mountains in north central Russia and across the Yakutsk Peninsula and Siberia and the Russian Far East. So we know that they've got, in shall we say, Sami folklore or Laplander folklore, they have a lot of legends and stories of the hollow earth and the idea of these light beings or advanced, shall we say, the remote deities of the wilderness that had existed in these vast, the faraway north of the Arctic polar region. So perhaps for the Sami or the Laplanders that live in these areas of northern Russia and also in parts of northeastern Finland, there is a collective racial and cultural memory of the Nordic Hyperboreans having once a vast civilization there. So I would definitely say that there is a lot of evidence there to connect that. And it's also interesting to note that the Sami or the Laplanders of northern Russia also say, in their stories, that the Hyperboreans were star-based, in that they worshipped the constellations. So they were seen as a stellar civilization. So although you have that, shall we say, the solar deity of Apollo Olympos, one of the 12 Olympians of classical Greece and Mount Olympos, actually living in Hyperborea, he represented literally the coming of the solar light, the coming of the sunlight in that summery, balmy, climate in that area of northern Russia. But they were predominantly worshippers of stellar masses and therefore of starlight, a stellar-based civilization.
What is the connection with like the Cyclopses and the one-eyed beings to Hyperborea? Because a lot of people see these as like hybrid type, genetically hybrid type beings, but they talk about the Cyclops and one-eyed beings because that's very interesting. Obviously, so Greek mythology as well.
Yeah, exactly. So in Greek mythology, you have the stories of these Cyclopean giants, these Cyclopean tribes that existed in the polar Urals and the northern Urals, all known as the Riphaean Mountains of north central Russia. And these were beings that were 12 to 14 feet in height. Both the Cyclopean giants and the Hyperborean giants, there was a mixture. So they were both racially similar, described again with bright red hair, bright beards, pale complexion, some of them covered in bodily tattoos. And they were very warlike, very ferocious. They were quite fearless in many ways, but they were quite advanced. Now, when we think of the Cyclopses, they are almost really in many ways antediluvian giants. They were really genetically perhaps and characteristically even older in terms of being giants on planet Earth than giants that we would say that look like perhaps enormous looking Homo sapiens, were much similar looking to humans, just on a much larger scale. So, yeah, and I think they were genetically related. We also have to remember that when you take a look at the civilization of Atlantis, both the Atlantean continent and the Atlantean islands, you have to remember there's a lot of stories concerning genetic hybridization. We know that the Atlanteans, these were Nordic Atlanteans. There must have been perhaps some racial and genetic connection between these Nordic Atlanteans and the Hyperboreans, but they were distinct and separate civilizations. And the Hyperboreans, I believe, were far older. I think they were the parent civilization on this earth. And even if they weren't, they literally would have appeared simultaneously and in parallel to what appears to be the civilization of Lemuria, which once existed in the Pacific Ocean today. Obviously, the largest remaining landmass, as it's known in Sanskrit, which is Mahalanka, meaning Great Island, is the landmass of Australia today, which formed part of the Lemurian continent. So we know again that there was genetic hybridization that took place. It's believed that the centaurs, the minotaurs, and harpies, and many other, and satyrs, and many other crossbreeds were created. And perhaps it's the case the Cyclopses, they were a genetic offshoot of, shall we say, the giants that looked like just like enormous looking humans, and they were hybridized in some way. And again, that's speculation, but it's interesting, to consider that they were perhaps that way. Maybe they were a bit unhinged psychologically and mentally, because you've got to remember the Cyclopses in Greek mythology have always been portrayed crazy, frenzied, very aggressive. When it comes to looking at like English folklore, you've got Jack and the Beanstalk, you've got all the accounts of these rather nasty giants that don't like humans, but then you've got huge amounts of stories from world folklore, and even from some of the accounts of the Native American tribes in the North American continent, where some of the white giants were friendly. We have to remember, as I said, that these giants had what appeared to be shining cities in the mountains, in the Appalachian Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, up in the Cascade Range, in the North American continent. And they were seen as these highly sophisticated white giants that wanted to remain private, away from the Native Americans. But then there was also other giants that seemed to want a war, and there was constant battling and conflicts going on with various Native American tribes. So it's a very mixed outlook. And I do believe that there was a genetic connection between the Cyclopses of Hyperborea and the white giants that we even know about on the North American continent. We also know that another connection is not just the fact that the white giants had red hair and red beards, but the Scythians also had red hair and red beard. And many of the accounts from many of the indigenous tribal communities in Central Asia and Eastern Asia that encountered these Scythians on the Russian steppes, the Asiatic steppes, described some of these Scythian Aryans as being maybe 9 feet to 11 feet in height. So it's almost as if they were carriers of some of the genetics of these Hyperborean giants. And again, they had the red hair and the red beards. So there's a lot of correlations genetically and racially between Hyperborea, the Cyclopses, the giants that just look like enormous 12 to 14 feet tall Homo sapiens and the Scythian Aryans. So
the Scythians as well, they supposedly went around Europe, up Gibraltar and up to the Scottish Highlands. So this is where an Alistair Murray Moffat actually states from his research that there is a connection genetically to the Great Scythia. It's fascinating.
That is correct. He did indeed. And, the fact that connection's been made, then you take a look, for example, at the legends of Phineas Farseid, who was this Scythian Aryan king from Irish mythology, both in the Fenian cycle and the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology, who founded the Irish nation, the Irish pedigrees, that's the Irish Celtic tribes, came from the genetics and the lineage of Phineas Farseid and his family. So that's very interesting because he was a Scythian. Then you've got the connection to Scotland. Well, the actual there's actually etymological connections between the word Scotland and therefore Scottish and the word Scythia, if you go back far enough. But then we have to remember also that the Scottish genetically were originally an Irish Celtic tribe. So ergo, we have a direct connection there all the way through.
So interesting. But in Hyperborea, they seem to be much more spiritually connected. That was what it would seem. And again, we have this annihilation of the spirit. And obviously they went from Scythia, and then Scythians then became the Tartarians. That's
correct?
Yeah, that's what I can see. Tell us more about that, the connection. So how it bridged into Tartaria.
I think you'll find although when we did an episode of Hidden History called Northern Paradise, we gave the timelines there, so obviously viewers can check that out. So when we take a look back, we can see very clearly there was a transition historically from the civilization of the Scythians into the emergence of what became Great Tartaria. So we know that there were again major climatic changes that took place. And what is interesting to note, it seems that a lot of the time there's a collapse that occurs and a re-emergence of a new civilization. It's based on major atmospheric and weather-based changes taking place that affect the farmland, the fertility of the landmass itself. And I think that's fundamentally what I see happen. We know that with the collapse of the civilization of the Scythian Aryans, there were vast, we're talking about millions of square acres of Russian taiga, which is obviously comprised of evergreen coniferous trees, such as the spruces, larches, and pine trees, and many others, including cedars. And there were massive fires within the Russian taiga. And so we can imagine vast amounts of the ecosystems, the food supplies that the Scythian Aryans relied upon as obviously food sources for their own societies and communities were also wiped out. So that splintered down, they would have had to literally have migrated in a westward movement. Again, they moved into parts of the Caucasus region. They moved obviously across to where around the Black Sea, or Eugene Sea as it was known at the time in Greek mythology and Greek history. They would have moved further away and around the Caspian Sea into Eastern Europe. And we know that the Saxons, for example, really were actually racially and genetically the Scythians. So the Saxons of northern Germany, who became the Anglo-Saxons, or the English in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, themselves were a dispersed colony of Scythians that resettled in another landmass, so they could obviously for farming purposes. Because what had happened was the Scythians were nomadic hunter-gatherers. So when they were obviously going into the Russian taiga, looking for their food sources, for sustenance to feed their societies and communities, their families, that was wiped out. So a lot of it had to change. They had to create a much more secure form of sustenance. And I do believe this connects into the rudimentary basics of what became, shall we say, more contemporary farming in the last few thousand years.
So I've noticed that a lot of imagery I've looked at of northern Russia, there tends to be a huge, especially in the northern part, almost like where there was explosions of some sort. There seems to be like holes in the landscape, lots of lakes. This is just speculation. There's no facts on this, but it's just from what I've seen. It does look like there seems to be that landmass was under attack. But what do you think on that?
From what I'd say that's inconclusive. I
Yeah.
would say yes, there's a lot of anomalies, and obviously geologists from Western science will come out and say they're just natural, formations over millions of years. The usual rhetoric. But what I know is actually it's the Gobi Desert region where there was a vast prehistoric war. But obviously, the Gobi Desert obviously encompasses large areas of southern Mongolia and also western China, and overlaps between those two countries in Eastern Asia. And the Mongolian desert was actually an inland sea. It had huge canals. There were pyramids built there, cities, and so
Karakota, I think it's called. The huge, unbelievable structure that was uncovered there.
Yeah, and there's many other cities buried under the vast amounts of sand dunes in the Gobi Desert. So that wouldn't have destroyed the civilization of Hyperborea because it was much lower located in the faraway north of northern Russia. We're talking obviously thousands of kilometers away. In terms of the jet stream, perhaps, but it may have been the case that there may have been some influence, but it's never been shown. It's more likely the case it's to do with climatic changes and the movements of these Nordic Hyperboreans across thousands of square kilometers to try and find safer and more secure areas to develop settlements, obviously, and rebirth their civilization. But coming back to the point of the free energy systems, we know that these pyramids had what appeared to be some kind of quartz capstones. The remnants of, shall we say, symmetrical quartz has been found. Hyperborean pyramids or Russian pyramids are predominantly being built from what appeared to be granite. So very, very strong. And then they're covered in lichens and mosses. And these are wilderness areas in northern Russia that are very overgrown with lots of trees and shrubs, and they're even very difficult to spot by satellite or helicopter. So it's taken teams of Russian archaeologists a lot of effort over many years to go trekking into those areas, orienteering using different types of ordnance survey to locate these areas, to do photographic analysis, chemical analysis. Much of this is not shared with Western science. It seems to be a complete shutdown on accepting the validity of their scientific findings. It's just classed as, it's just natural geological formations. There's nothing to see here. Just move along, people. Same story as usual. So what is going on is there's a deliberate cover-up. The fact is they did have free energy systems. They were able to, like with Great Tartaria, they would be using these pyramids as healing temples, as enormous telluric electricity capacitors for the storing, transmission of the energies that were coming from the atmosphere above northern Russia and obviously the Arctic North Polar region. So they had all that. So obviously the Tartarian tablets that have been found by archaeologists also have what appears to be a Proto-Phoenician script. But again, this completely conflicts and creates a massive contradiction with Western science, because archaeologists say the Phoenicians were from the Middle East, from Canaan, which was north of what was known as Judea at the time. It wasn't called Israel. In the Levant of Western Asia, they had colonies in parts of southern Europe. Obviously, we've heard about the tin mines in Cornwall in southwest England. The Phoenicians were apparently there mining for that metal. And but we know that the Phoenicians were pretty much the greatest navigators of all the seas and the oceans of planet Earth have ever been known in world history. They founded
and they probably had a few maps as well.
Oh yeah, and they were experts. They were expert at using the stars, the constellations, and the stars to navigate. So they were transatlantic. They were certainly trans-Pacific navigators. We know they found archaeological remains of Phoenician settlements and Proto-Phoenician script in parts of Queensland in Western Australia. We know that they found Proto-Phoenician script in parts of the Amazon jungle in Western Brazil. So these are just small examples. Now, it's interesting to note that if you go back and look at ancient historical accounts, it's known that many of the Phoenicians were described as having bright red beards and red hair and very ruddy complexions. So we had that connection, the same as the bright red hair and the red beards of the Scythian Aryans, the white giants, many of these Cyclopean giants, and therefore these Hyperborean cyclopses that lived in the Ural Mountains of north central Russia. Also, look at all the accounts given by so many of the Native American tribes in the United States of America and in Canada. When they encountered these giants, they referred to them as the white giants and were called the white giants, in their own languages. So there has to be some kind of genetic and racial significance to those characteristics. So it's just basically about data aggregation here, looking at these facts, looking at all world folklore, looking at the Sami folklore of the Laplanders of northeastern Finland and of northwestern Russia, north central Russia, and northeastern Russia. It's about making that effort to study. It's about really understanding why there's such a huge passion for Russian Hyperboreanism amongst the Russian people today, and the connections there also with the massive reemergence of the Russian Orthodox Church and therefore Russian Christianity, because we have to remember that obviously when Great Tartaria existed, those chapels, churches, and cathedrals, many of them were repurposed in Russia. So there's a connection there, because obviously Christ consciousness was a prime directive, if you like, of the Nordic Hyperboreans. It was also a prime directive of the Tatarians, or the Nordic Tatarians, or the Slavic Tatarians. It was the same thing. Again, it was seen as so important for the integrity of each soul personality, for their spiritual development, to really make that effort to keep focused and aligned collectively within the Christ consciousness.
And that would have automatically made people think positively about each other and actually want positive communities, you see. But Steve, it's absolutely incredible information. And just so people know, where can people find this information out? I know you've mentioned it about the blogs and stuff like this online, but give people some pointers where people can find out more about Hyperborea and do their own research.
Sure. Yeah. So if people want to look into the Sami folklore, and that's spelled Sami, Sami, also known as the Laplanders. And again, you had to kind of make a bit of effort, because a lot of their information hasn't been translated. There's not a great amount, as usual. Yeah. And so you've got, again, it takes quite a bit of study and effort to really look into that. And ironically, if you were to, be a Russian citizen in the Russian Federation, and you had connections to people in the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, you'd find that a lot of the Russian archaeologists and anthropologists there, obviously they are very well versed in this knowledge, and obviously have made very detailed studies for well over 100 years into the Sami folklore of the Laplanders, and also actually many of the Turkic tribes. Look at Turkic folklore. So you're looking into the various types of Turkic folklore that exist in places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and many other areas of what's now known as the former Soviet Union, that are obviously countries in their own right, but they have a lot of very interesting accounts and stories. Also, you take a look at the accounts from Slavic folklore and Slavic mythology, obviously connecting that mainly to a lot of the Russians. So they have accounts connecting the idea of the hollow earth to some beautiful, magical northern paradise or polar paradise, that once existed. And we know that there's many Vedic scholars that specialized in trying to create some kind of correlation and connection between the Aryans of Vedic India and their origins, where they may have migrated from. And a lot of the time, the actual information seems to direct them back up into northern Russia.
Well, Stephen, that's incredible as always. Thank you, my brother. It's absolutely brilliant. And as Stephen said, it's about educating yourself and learning. And we have all these tools at our fingertips now. We can find this information out. It's not like we have to go down to a library now and get a book out. We've got this all this information in front of us at home. So maybe switch your television off if you have one, and maybe go on and do research, find information out, facts, history. History is amazing, and this world is amazing as well. But you can also purchase our book, Mysterious Realities, which is now available on Amazon and paperback and ebook. You can also purchase direct from my website, which is the links below. And it's thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for another brilliant episode in Hyperborea and Tartaria. There's lots more of these to come. But for now, it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.